we're ready to try out a live demo. Always a good thing to do at conferences. So, looking forward to this one. Yes, hand it over to Matt, but he'll introduce himself and the panel. But going to have a great conversation and then see some real-world action of Knowbl. So,
awesome. Thanks, Derek. So today's case study called "No Training Required." We're going to be discussing a newer approach with technology that really allows intents to be built with three words that you don't really see in conversational AI: speed, ease, and scalability. So my name is Matt Taylor. I'm the head of product and a co-founder at Knowbl, and I'm joined by the panelists today, so I will be the moderator. And we got Dr. Parker Hill, who is the CTO and co-founder of Knowbl, and then Michael Cruden, who is CTO and founder of Insightrade. So before we get into any demo, just would like to give each of the panelists a chance to discuss their background, a little bit about their company. So starting with you, Dr. Parker, can you tell us a little bit about your background and really the motivation behind Knowbl, and just how you came about the technology that really allows this new approach?
Yeah, so I started my, is this coming through? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so I started my journey in conversational AI kind of from an academic perspective while I was in grad school. So as I was kind of going through kind of the research experience, kind of learning the newest technology, building upon that newest technology, one thing I realized pretty quickly is, like, when I pull up Alexa or I pull up some search on someone's website, and then you look at what's out there in academia, what's out there in research labs, there's this big disconnect, right? And so I was very excited to kind of move on from this, and I actually joined a company as a very early member called Clink. When I left, moved on from Clink, I was the chief architect there. And really what you see is everyone's still kind of trying to shoehorn this kind of older technology into solving these problems that we have much better solutions to. And so that's really kind of what led me to start Knowbl. Is there's just a lot of opportunity in terms of what technology can do today versus like what we're trying to use. And it's not so much that we're just not taking the research that's out there and applying it to the problems. There's certainly a number of issues with that, right? There's kind of this gap between what the research can do and then what research we need to do to actually bring it to production. Things like how do we find intents and build intents quickly? In academia, it's always about how do we move the model performance for this large data set to 95% to 97%. It's never about how do we build intents quickly or how do we solve a user's end problem. So that's really what kind of motivated me to do this and take this newer technology and figure out where those gaps were and kind of bridge those gaps with Knowbl.
Okay. Hi, I've got 20 years background in web application development. And something unique with me is that I taught myself how to code while I was finishing my business degree. So I bring something unique to the table in that not only do I know how to implement the solutions, I can zoom out and look from the top level and see why we're implementing those solutions. And so over the past year, I've been working on founding Insightrade. We saw an opportunity in the market essentially to try and solve the problem of information overload, which is there's just an onslaught of information. When you seek out to, like, what's my next investment, you have so many options and so many places to try and determine what's that source of truth that you're going to follow to make the actual possible singular decision there. So we've built a site around, we're building a social network that's based around surfacing good ideas and also assisting people with researching these new investments with a focus on the younger demographic, so that we're gonna have that as a target market that builds up as we build the business.
Thank you. So I'll keep my intro somewhat short and sweet. So I also was at Clink with Parker, joined in about 2018. So I was the director of product over there, mainly responsible for our virtual assistant in banking called Feeney. So we at Feeney had been deployed with multiple top U.S. banks and international banks as well. And as the product owner, one of the things I always noticed was reacting quickly to the market was near impossible. Firsthand during COVID, a lot of times, I would be asked by our customers, hey, can you build XYZ intents? And, I go back to the team and I say, hey, this is what we need. What's the timeline on this? And it'd be 2 months, 3 months, and it's, that's not going to be doable. That, they already saw their contact centers being hit, so, that doesn't really solve the problem for them. And so when talking to Parker here about this newer technology and thinking overall about the customer experience and how there's just, it really is broken when you think about all these different siloed channels that people go to find information. It's been discussed, throughout the day here, but we're looking at search, we're looking at chat, we're looking at calling the contact centers, all these different experiences. But at the end of the day, the user is really looking for information, and content is being developed at an exponential pace right now. So it really just made sense when we're talking about how do we connect our users, our customers to that content by not looking at it so much as a per channel problem, but more as just this overall arching source of truth, connecting them to that. Now they choose that channel and let them do it through digital, through calling the contact center, however they want, but just allowing them to do it on their own. So that's kind of my motivation from the customer experience perspective of how Knowbl got started. So a few shots at takeaways here. At the end of this, I think some of these will make sense. The first thing we want to talk about is how there really is no training required with this new approach of leveraging transformer-based language models. Closing the loop on the voice of the customer, and that's kind of what I already alluded to, is being able to react in a quick and scalable approach. And then ultimately, how can we take these learnings and now transform the way that those more complex transactional experiences, as we hear in the market, can be used. So with that, we're going to start with the demo before I get into asking these folks a lot of great questions. But first, going to show you guys a live demo of Ava. So Ava is actually the virtual concierge on Insightrade's platform, and this is actually powered by Knowbl. So go in here and start asking some questions. Hey, so I've been saving a lot of money recently, and I've been thinking about buying some stocks. Do you have any good suggestions?
Please log into your Robinhood account to place the trade.
What's the price of Netflix?
Which stock would you...
Can you give me the price of Netflix?
The price for Netflix, NFLX, is at $274 United States dollars and 97 cents, which is up 7.98% today.
How much has that changed over the last 3 months?
The price for Netflix, NFLX, is up 13.30% in the last 3 months.
What about for Tesla?
The price for Tesla, TSLA, is down 33.46% in the last 3 months.
Can you show me some insights on that stock?
Here are the market insights related to Tesla.
I heard NASDAQ is up today, and can you tell me a little bit more about what that is?
NASDAQ, based in New York City, is the second largest stock exchange in the world by market capitalization, second only to the New York.
Can you tell me, do you have any news articles on Apple?
Here are some recent articles related to Apple.
What's the price to earnings ratio for that stock?
The current price to earnings ratio for Apple, AAPL, is 24.
What about the operating margin?
The current operating profit margin for Apple, AAPL, is 0.30.
By the way, can you tell me how my technology watch list is doing? Can you tell me how my technology watch list is doing?
You have 4 investments that have gone up and 2 investments that have gone down since adding to your tech watch list.
So just wanted to give a quick demo there, obviously some live tech, but the cool part there is, when you think about the idea of placing trades, especially how we've seen so many retail investors pop up, especially during COVID. It almost became a hobby for a lot of people to be able to find information very easily. And that's part of what we're going to discuss here from both how we're able to do it on the technology standpoint, but then also what's the value that that ultimately brings to the Insightrade community. So starting now, going back to what we were talking about with these takeaways, when we hear, Parker, we talk about a lot in this industry now about conversationalizing content and being able to automate the process of building these intents. And so really wanted to step back and kind of ask, how is that possible? Why is that different from what is being done traditionally in the market? And just overall, what does that actually mean for an enterprise brand that's looking to invest in technology like this?
Yeah, so I think a big part of this, right, we keep talking about building intents. We want to go look through our data sets, look through call logs, figure out what those insights are or what the people are asking about, group those together, and then start building intents. But the reality is we already have all that information somewhere, right? We've talked about this, multiple people have talked about this today, where it's like there's some source of truth. We have some knowledge base. We have some support center that has this information already. And so that's how we started thinking about this, right? There's a lot of kind of new technology to do unsupervised learning, few-shot learning, where you can take in a large amount of data, find general insights about it. And so what we did was we built a model that would actually kind of go through your knowledge base, or I guess kind of a step before that, right? You have some sort of integration to some knowledge base. This could be your call center logs, this could be your knowledge base, this could be an agent support system. You build kind of we built a kind of a standardized integration process that then goes to a model that then goes through the data set and then it basically inspects this data set, finds what the intents are, and then links it to sees what the content is, figures out like what intents represent this data and how would we possibly respond to that, right? And so you kind of think of it like a search approach, but rather than thinking about a kind of like a document as the kind of the most granular aspect, instead we're breaking this down to more granular pieces, right? We're thinking about here's a paragraph, here's a sentence. These things answer these particular questions, and then we can automatically build out that kind of conversational architecture that you typically do with kind of an intent-driven approach, rather than saying, I have a set of FAQs here, here's an FAQ I want to support, here's a response to that, here's an FAQ I want to support, here's a response for that. You can actually go through this automatically, understand the semantic meanings of these questions and the semantic meanings of these answers, and then put these together automatically. And so, again, this kind of goes back to the search, and this came up before as well, where search is kind of, right now, this kind of one-off thing where you ask a question and then you get an answer, and there's no kind of follow-up. If I ask, like, I don't know, what's the price of Tesla today, and then if you ask a question like, can you give me some insights for that, you wouldn't expect that from a normal search channel. And that's one of the big challenges here when you're trying to kind of automatically kind of build this conversational architecture, automatically build these intents. It's not just like a one-off problem. We're not just trying to build a bunch of FAQs. We want to actually build something that's conversational, which requires maintaining that context, which requires those kind of follow-up type questions. And beyond just kind of the need to do this, also if you think from a kind of a development perspective, and I know this had also been mentioned earlier today, where we're talking about, well, if you have maybe 20 intents, you can have a kind of you don't necessarily need data scientists, but when you get to 100, now you're going to need a more kind of experienced engineering team. And I think this really comes back to part of the reason to that is it's kind of a nonlinear process, right? If we keep adding intents, the scope of the data and the scope of like the interactions between these intents continues to grow in kind of a nonlinear speed. And so if you think about, if you have 100 intents, there are 100 other intents that may be related. You have to kind of connect these together. And so that's where we've come up, a big piece of kind of automating this kind of build-out process is actually recognizing kind of semantic areas and then automatically recognizing here's a semantic area about stock prices, here's a semantic area about stock insights. These are potentially overlapping. What are the potential transitions or questions you might ask? And then populating that in addition to kind of the one-off type of questions. So really, from our perspective, right, there's the kind of the normal search type one-off questions, but really if you want to automatically conversationally enable something, that contextual piece is a big part of the equation there.
Awesome. And Michael, so when we talk about conversationalizing all the content that Insightrade has, especially as you guys build a community, I remember from the very first meeting we had, it was you guys had so much content, and you wanted to be able to allow your users to find that very easily. So can you talk a little bit about just the value that brought, and what that actually means for Insightrade?
Yes, absolutely. So we had a very extensive knowledge base already built up. And by implementing their technology, we came out of the gates. We started out with 600 intents inside of Ava's bot here. And then as we were able to watch the conversation log and see what people were asking about, it was incredible how much value we gained as an organization from that. We could see, instead of trying to survey our users, they were asking us what they were concerned about. So we then went and we took that to heart. We tracked that information. We developed answers to the questions that weren't answered, and we're already at over 1,000 intents. So I really think that that's significant. We're really leveraging the technology in that level, and here we see where it's headed as well. And I also want to note that we were able to do this without data scientists, without conversation flow experts, that we just sat down and just as builders, we got to work and we got it done using this platform.
Awesome. So, going to the voice of the customer, I remember early on, that's kind of the biggest fear as a product owner is when you finally put your virtual assistant out there. You can test it as well as you want, but until you put it out in the wild, you really have no idea how end users are going to react to it. And there's inevitably going to be blind spots. And so, in my experience, I was prepared for that. I guess what I wasn't prepared for is how long it took to react to those blind spots. And it was funny, after every intent we added, there became a longer timeline to the next intent. And you think to yourself, well, can't we get better at this? Like, we're taking longer after each intent we're adding. That doesn't make much sense. So I wanted to ask you, Parker, from the technical standpoint, can you explain a little bit more about why it gets increasingly more difficult every intent you add, and then ultimately how the transformer model and this newer approach that we're using, and how that ultimately really takes away that difficulty and ultimately goes towards that word that everyone wants to use, but I don't think has been really possible so far in this industry, which is a scalable approach.
Yeah, so I guess I just kind of to start, right, if we think about, like, when we were mentioning before, right, and directly integrating your kind of data into the AI, that's like the first step. That's kind of that prototyping phase where you want to build something out quickly, you want to start testing it, you want to start evaluating it, you want to start getting that voice of the customer. And then certainly that kind of that iterative step where you want either it's not performing quite as you'd like, or they're getting questions that aren't that you don't have in your knowledge base right now, or the AI is not being able to handle. And so that iteration step, as you said, right, if you look at a kind of more traditional approach, that's a very long process. And usually, from what I've seen just in previous experience, a lot of times you'll quickly get to that, like, I want to build 100 intents, I'm going to build these out real quickly, and then you work with the company to kind of get that to a place where the kind of the accuracy and the quality work well in general. That part is the part where, in my experience, that's where the company's teaming starts to not want to be involved in the project. That's where you start running into the problems where a user asks a question, they didn't get the answer that you wanted to, you give that to the engineers to work on, they'll play with the data for a while, do a bunch of feature engineering, you'll get a different experience, I would say, and then you'll get another question kind of on a similar topic, or perhaps it broke something else that was working previously, right? And you kind of goes this long iterative process. And really the reason behind this, or the reason we have this kind of big, the reason that process is so long is just fundamental to kind of what I'm calling kind of the last generation of NLU technology. And to me, I guess maybe just to give a little bit more color to that, so to me, kind of the last generation of NLU technology, that's the technology that doesn't actually understand language. It understands patterns that it's learning from your training data. And basically, like, if you think about this, right, you have, if you're building 100 intents, I'm going to add 100 utterances to each of these intents as training data. The model's just going to go through, look for patterns that represent the different ways you might ask this. It's going to look for patterns, and then it's going to assume that pattern now means this intent. It's not understanding the language itself in the sense that if you have some kind of bias in your data set, something like that, it's going to learn those patterns. You're going to have these features that it's learned that don't really match what you're kind of expecting. And the reason it's such a big problem is you can just imagine, like, if we're building a stock, given how kind of the lifespan of one of these projects, or as you kind of continue to grow the scope, you start with something like stock price, right? I'm collecting a bunch of data asking about stock prices or how much a certain stock costs, that sort of thing. Now, perhaps I collected this data a month ago, and perhaps at the time, Twitter stock was the most interesting stock, and so I crowdsourced a bunch of data. I had my engineers come up with some data. Now you're going to see that Twitter show up a lot in your data set. Again, the model doesn't really understand language, so it doesn't really understand the semantics or the intent that you're getting at. It just understands the patterns that it sees present in the data set. And so now it's kind of associating the word Twitter with stock price. Perhaps if that's kind of the only intent you have, not a big deal. But then you can imagine as you continue to build the model, like if you're building a stock performance or stock insights, a month later, now perhaps, I don't know, Meta is the most interesting stock. You crowdsource data for stock insights and you get a lot of data about Meta. Now you've got Twitter associated with stock prices, you've got Meta associated with stock insights. Now if I ask for stock price of Meta, it's going to get confused because it sees there's a strong correlation between insights and our insight intent, and there's a strong correlation between Twitter and our insight intent. And so when you see these two patterns, you now have these incorrectly learned features in some sense. And so what we call this a lot in I don't know, on the engineering side of things, we'll call that rebalancing the model or rebalancing the feature set. And so what this entails then is when I see one of these issues arise, right, I see someone asking the insights about Meta and it took me to, or Twitter, and it took me to the stock price intent. As an engineer or a data scientist, what I have to do then is figure out, okay, which feature did it learn incorrectly? Go through the data sets on these two, my stock insights data set, my stock prices data set, and then I need to go through and figure out, okay, why are these biases present and how do I fix them? And so I go through the data set, recognize, oh, here's a pattern that it's learned incorrectly, rebalance those tokens or those patterns in these data sets, and that way these two intents become agnostic to those specific patterns that we didn't want it to learn. The problem though is, as you can see, right, we've added a new intent and now I have to go back to my previous intents. When you're building 100 intents or tens of intents, that's perhaps doable, right? That's the example we heard earlier, where it's like if you have 20 intents, perhaps you don't need a data scientist, but you start getting to 100, and now that becomes important. And then you can imagine as it gets larger and larger, you have 1,000 intents. I've got 100 intents about stock prices or just stocks in general. I've got to make sure that across all 100 intents, that the features that I don't want it to learn are now balanced. And so this kind of leads to like this quadratic time complexity or quadratic level of effort where every intent I add is dependent on all the previous intents and balancing of these kind of tokens or patterns across these intents. And so that's really why you see this drastic fall off after you get 100, maybe 1,000 intents across most of the kind of experiences that I've seen in the past. And so the kind of solution we're looking at now is you don't build a model that just learns patterns. You want to build a model that learns semantics. So before you try to start kind of doing this mapping, right, using a deep neural network, BIOS team, recurrent neural network, whatever it is, before you start kind of processing the kind of specific tokens, learning patterns, you don't want to process it on these raw tokens that the machine doesn't understand. You want to process the actual semantics. So these transform models or language models, this is the approach of actually converting this into something that has semantic meaning, something that's been basically unsupervised or zero-shot training on a very large corpus that represents the kind of general domains, general information about language. You map it from these words into a kind of a semantic vector and basically just a numeric representation of what it means, and then you look for patterns on that representation rather than the specific patterns of the training data that you've seen. In addition to kind of learning the semantics rather than learning the kind of the token patterns, you also get the big benefit that the model understands kind of language in English or whatever language you're training with by just naturally, right, you're just learning semantic vectors. You can imagine it requires a lot less data. I no longer have to give it 100 examples of asking the price of something because I don't have to look for all the synonyms and all the different sentence structures you may see. If we can just transform all of that into a kind of semantic representation, now we just have to look for that representation. And I guess maybe just as kind of an analogy, if you're thinking about building like a customer support team, right? You're not going to think like, we're going to have no requirements, right? If you're going to have some job description for someone you're going to hire to do customer support, right? They're going to have to speak the language that they're supporting. They're going to have to understand basic concepts of what kind of that domain. I guess what I'm proposing is, questioning is, why do we train AI models that don't understand English or understand language in the first place? Why are we trying to teach an intent or teach the business, kind of the business domain, and hope it just learns your language kind of as a side effect, sort of? So really, I think if there's one thing I'd like everyone to take away is like, look at your vendor and check, does it actually understand language, or does it just learn the patterns because you've dumped so much data in there, and just by kind of a side effect has learned kind of some of the language that you're looking for?
Yeah, and I remember the conversations we've had at Clink. You'd tell me all that, and I'd say, so how long is it going to take to actually build this then? And it'd be like, well, a month or two, but now it doesn't take that long, and you're able to just add the content. And so, going back to what you were saying, Michael, about you guys were able to look at the conversation logs, see what everyone was asking. Can you talk a little bit about, like, now what does that reaction time look like, and then what is that value that it brings to where you can continuously update that feedback loop in a really rapid time?
Yeah, I have a good example about the voice of the customer and how we're listening to it. And a lot of our knowledge base was built by a financial planner. So one of the things that just came up that was really interesting was people have a lot of anxiety to ask questions to a financial planner. They feel like they're admitting that they don't know enough to manage their own finances, and that's a hurdle that stops them from actually hiring one. So what we found out is we had a veteran. They experienced a lot of anxiety, from their experiences. So they actually felt comfortable using our AI bot here. They started asking a sequence of questions that they wanted to get familiarized with before they hired a financial planner. And not only was that valuable, but also there's a relay of value there in that we've identified this person is about to hire someone, and we could eventually ask them a question at the end of that, say, can we help you find a planner? So that's just a nice approachable example, I feel, that really ties it all together. And I don't know if that fully answers your question, Matt, but I just thought that was a nice way to just kind of put that forward.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's really where voice of the customer comes into play, right?
Yeah.
Is, we talked about this, and I've heard this throughout the day, is not just directing them towards a pattern of, hey, like, you have to click 1, 2, 3, 4 here, whether it's on the phone, in the digital channel, but it's really saying, hey, how can I help you?
Yes.
And that's really what, we go back to at Knowbl all the time, is how can I help you? Let them decide what they need, right? And in that case, you found out interesting information that not only poses for you guys to actually bolster up more and more content that can make the, Ava perform better, but in turn also, identified a very, very, high return lead that you could ultimately give to an RIA. So last but not least, one of the things, again, we hear a lot in this industry is transactional experiences. So when I think of a transactional experience, I think of, now we're not just allowing the user to retrieve information, we're actually allowing the user to complete something, complete an action, where it takes back and forth conversations where you need to gather information from that user, whether it's paying a bill, updating account information. And I can tell you, again, from my experience, those were very, very long experiences that took a lot of resources to build. So I wanted to ask you, Parker, how are you thinking about, and transforming these experiences with the same type of technology that you've been referring to this, this whole time, called zero-shot learning? And really, what does that ultimately look like, in the future? Obviously, there's still going to be those back-end integrations that happen, but from the data perspective, what does that ultimately look like?
Yeah, so I guess from my perspective, a big part of the kind of the build-out experience, right? I guess maybe I can start by saying, kind of defining from a technical perspective how I see transactional experiences. So from the user perspective, there's kind of the difference of like completing an action or completing something that's more personalized perhaps. But from kind of a technical perspective, really the difference is we're not just like classifying an intent, right? We're not just saying the user's asking about stock prices or the user wants to make a trade or something. There's this entity or slot extraction piece. That's kind of the difference between just kind of FAQs and this kind of more transactional experience. And what this means is basically, if I say, give a question or make a statement like, I want to make a transfer of $100, extracting that $100 out, that's the entity extraction piece, right? There are additional key pieces of information that are present inside the user's utterance beyond just a single label. And so if we think back about kind of the machine learning models piece of this, those models tend to be a lot more complicated than your intent classification. Rather than just saying I have 10, 20 tokens in an utterance, I need to find a pattern. This is either checking my balance, making a transfer, stock prices, something like that. We now have to, for each token or each span of our utterance, we have to recognize, is this a price? Is this a source account? Is this a destination account? Is this a stock? Right? There are a lot of different labels we can potentially give to every single token in the user's utterance. And so again, traditionally, if we kind of using the more like many-shot learning approaches, again, like a BIOS-TM or neural network, something like that, we would have a massive corpus of example utterances. We'd go through or have a data scientist, crowdsource, someone go through and label, this is a money amount, this is a money amount, this is a source account, this is a source account. You go and label each of our utterances with all the slot examples that they have. And then again, since the model doesn't actually understand language in any way, it's just looking for patterns. It's looking for tokens around a money amount tend to be certain, like a dollar sign. I mean, that's I guess, perhaps an easier one, but for a stock name or something, that's a more complicated sentence structure. And so just like in kind of few-shot learning for classification, we can apply a kind of a similar transformer model where we're actually taking the kind of semantic representation of the different tokens within the context of of the user's utterance, map that to our kind of high-dimensional vector space, and then recognize when I have kind of these semantic meanings or these kind of semantics around the sentence or the structure of my sentence, this is a likely this is a likely stock price, or this is a likely name of a stock, something like that. And so that's basically, we're kind of applying the same approach where we're kind of transforming it from just a simple pattern recognition problem to one of mapping it to an actual language understanding the model has through unsupervised learning, and then basically using those semantics to do this slot extraction. And as a result of this, I mean, you've seen search and things like that where you can just upload your corpus and it'll kind of do keyword matching, TF, IDF, something like that. We're actually able to do kind of that few-shot learning even for slot extraction, where you could build a money transfer intent with just a couple example utterances for your intent, and then just a couple terms for the kind of the specific money amount that you want to transfer, and it will automatically kind of recognize what these semantic vector representation within the context of that sentence look like, and then basically do that mapping for you. And so basically, instead of doing hundreds of intents for kind of classification labels, and usually we'd see like thousands of labeled utterances for kind of slot or entity extraction, we're seeing just a few. And so that's really kind of the way I think the technology is going in general, and kind of what we are now building out at Knowbl, where you can actually build one of these transactional experiences from a data perspective. As Matt mentioned, right, there's still kind of that data integration, making the business logic take care of the money transfer, making sure it maps to a specific account that the user has. But the actual like AI piece of this, you no longer need a massive data science team in order to kind of label all the examples and kind of build it out that way.
So it looks like we're pretty much running out of time. So I want to give, I know, Richard, you had a question, it looked like?
Yeah, so I guess just kind of summarize the question. Basically, the question is like, can we actually learn, like, does this approach allow us to learn kind of longer sentence context as well as kind of the shorter ones that we're perhaps more accustomed to? Is that fair to say, or? Yeah, actually, that's a great intuition there, because actually, if you kind of just use one of these kind of models off the shelf and just do exactly what you're describing, right? I take a sentence fragment and I just run a model through and like A or B, or what is like, which of the options is it? If I just ask that question directly and kind of pass in kind of the user's utterance, that's not enough context for the kind of model to extract that insight. And so actually, we have as kind of part of our kind of research project and part of our kind of part of building that out, like bridging that gap, as I mentioned before, right? Bridging that gap between what's available in research, the models that can do this extraction, bridging it to something that's actually useful in industry, solving a real world problem where the user is going to have follow-up questions, the user is going to give us sentence fragments. You actually have to do kind of the sentence augmentation step. And so what you do is you have that initial utterance, we have that kind of follow-up fragment utterance, we do kind of a transformation between these kind of two user utterances, and then the specific information that we're looking for, kind of concatenate these three pieces of information into a specific way, and then allow the model to run through it with that additional context. So I would say we have certainly seen success in those kind of more fragmented type responses, but certainly that requires some kind of augmentation or some additional technology to kind of bridge that gap.
For more analysis and expertise in conversational AI and intelligent authentication, visit opusresearch.net.